Well, the emotion I decided to address today, and we're just going to do the one, is guilt. That's a big one in a lot of people's lives. And as I really worked to put this one together and spent some time on it, realizing the complexity of it and kind of the dual use of the word. So guilt, as a fact, is different than the emotions attached, especially in our culture, to the concept of guilt. I think there are, I think every culture would use the word or a similar concept of guilt to imply responsibility. Properly used, it's a term that points out the party that's responsible for some form of actual wrongdoing or offense that goes against a rule or a law. So there's that use of it, and then we'll see there's a second, the big part where the work needs to be done. So when we look at this word law in today's confused world, clarify the word law so that we can understand the usefulness of the word guilt, because it is a useful word. It has a place. As an emotion, my offering is it's purely destructive, but as a concept, it can be useful. So, clarifying law. Law, and we're going back to the Aramaic now, is not what our culture would consider to be the word law. In our culture, the word law is the rule of a superior. And our culture would dictate that the superior's rules have to be followed. Now, they could be totally and completely out of harmony with law. But our culture would say, well, we've got a statute. Technically speaking, the so-called laws of this culture are statutes. They're not laws at all. No man could ever pass a law, because law, as opposed to being the rule of a superior, is simply how the energy system works. It's the way within the actuality of this energy system that we call life, the way that system works. The law, that I bring up often, that I repeat, because it's been so violated in our culture. A la Yeshua from 2,000 years ago was where he's asked, what's the most important law? And he doesn't answer, love God, love neighbor as yourself. That's not the way it works. And law in Aramaic is the way it works. It's just the way the energy system works. So what Yeshua answers in that case, and it ties in here to get clear on the difference between guilt as a description of responsibility for an action and guilt as an emotional disorder, as a series of thought disorders. So in Aramaic, he tells people how it works to function as a human being. And what he says is, you must have Rachma, filter in the frontal lobes of the brain that, when open, it's a gateway that allows human life to enter the human form. And human life is love. Love moving in a human energy system is life. Anything that inhibits life would be against the law, against the way it works. So in that particular case, Yeshua answers them, have Rachma when you think of neighbor, when you think of the Creator. In other words, and they're pretty much, that's the limit of the objects of attention you can have in terms of the human world, is your neighbors. And in Aramaic, the word neighbor means anybody that you think about, and the Creator. So he's saying, you need to keep love present. You need to keep your human life alive. So have Rachma when you think of Creator, when you think of neighbor, and then, as opposed to what the Greeks translate to is, and you love them like yourself. In Aramaic, it's in order to maintain self. So when Rachma is active, you maintain awareness of yourself as love. And therefore you have a human life. That's the way human life works. And that's essentially the question that we're asking in that particular case. So I use that to illustrate what I mean by the word law. So one who violates or goes against the flow of life, or in the case of this culture, the rules men have made, is labeled guilty. And all that means is that they're responsible for a particular act, for what has occurred. And if you don't mind, I just took a second to add a note there. So now let's move into the confused world where run by the minds of men in carbon-based memory rather than by law. And in this confused world today, all that needs to happen is for one to be on the other side of a belief that's held by any given individual to be judged as guilty. You know, you look in the political realm and you notice that everything that's hurled out, no matter what somebody does, they're guilty simply because they're on the other side of the equation. Now we've moved out of the realm of the fact of guilt, responsibility for a behavior, and we have to begin to address, and this is really the core of the reason why I decided to go for this one today, need to address guilt as the destructive emotional state that it is. So, and recognizing what it is, number one, realizing that it's healable, and two, that it's a composite emotional, it's made up of many factors. So guilt as an emotion is rooted in a complex of thought disorders, and in order to be free of this emotion, as we define it, each of the thought disorders that contribute to this complex needs to be individually addressed and forgiven. So, you know, one might end up doing 2, 10, 100 worksheets around guilt as an emotion to address each and every aspect of that, the thought disorders that go into this complex that we call guilt as an emotion. In order to be free of it, each aspect of it's going to need to be addressed and forgiven. So this complex includes thoughts based in fear, fear of rejection, fear of derision, fear of punishment, fear of harm, fear of loss. Each of those is a different thought disorder. Now, somebody might be, you know, when guilt as an emotion comes up in them, might be totally focused. Their thought disorder might be all about being rejected by, let's say, their family or their culture. Where someone else might think of, you know, their thought disorder behind their guilt might be that they're going to be harmed. You know, if they had a parent who enforced the family law with a fist, then it might be harm that and punishment, the derision aspect of guilt. It might be about loss. It might be about being blamed. And it might move up to and including death. Each thought that would produce one of those things I've just described in any given mind is part of the complex of thought disorders that often makes up what we call the emotion of guilt. So as such, guilt is based in fear. You know, yesterday we talked about fear quite a bit. If you missed that show, you might go into the archives, go to our website, whyagain.org. And Jeannie, I'm thinking maybe we take today's show and what we did yesterday and put them together. And actually, I'm going to run through more emotions as we go through future shows. But so guilt is based in fear and closely related to shame, which we talked about yesterday. So you might review those in this context. It's a mix of thoughts resulting from a negative moral self-evaluation and thoughts of self-criticism that makes the error equating oneself with one's behavior. So if, strictly speaking, the actual term guilt would be responsibility for a negative behavior. But when I step into the moral realm and I start mixing negative thoughts about I'm wrong, I'm bad, I'm guilty, I did something that hurt somebody, and on it goes, and then one equates that unconscious complex. Rarely is somebody in touch with the specifics of what the guilt is about. It's something that's been purposely instilled in most people. But if you make the error of equating yourself with your behavior, where perhaps you have transgressed a real or an imagined rule, or maybe you performed a harmful quality of thought, attitude, action, and behavior, and when that happens, it's often cultural or religious. So as such, thought disorders resulting in the emotion of guilt is often purposely instilled by so-called superiors in order to prevent a particular behavior or behaviors. And I think it comes from the errant thinking, the thought disorder in the mind of the superior, that if I can instill enough guilt in this person, then they'll stay away from this behavior. If I can instill enough fear, enough derision, enough, self-disrespect or disapproval from others or from me, the authority says, if I can instill enough of that, then maybe they'll never do that behavior. But what they haven't understood is that because this whole process is based in disordered thinking, it's going to backfire. It's going to produce exactly the result it was intended to avoid. Because it comes from, rather than thinking in harmony with life, in harmony with law, all of that guilt stuff is based in disharmony with law. It's out of order with law. It's itself is off the mark. And what happens when someone has had guilt instilled in them, especially from an early age, and the number of different thought disorders that get collected. Remember, we've talked about the file folder effect. When someone, if you think about someone's file on negative thinking about self, the collection of thoughts that are there might be something that's been gathered over a period of decades in relationship to parents, in relationship to authority figures, in relationship to civic or religious figures. It can be a huge complex of, I'm broken. If you remember the chart, the physiological effects of emotional suppression, this guilt one ties right into the first thought disorder that takes us out of our natural state. And my offering is, we are naturally designed to live in enthusiasm. If you look at the child, how enthusiastically they come at everything. And in theos means in love, connected to love, in God, literally. And that's what we're designed for. But when the child is rejected by the authority and given a thought disorder, offered a thought disorder about how you're broken, there's something wrong with you, that thought creates pain, and that pain disconnects one from the awareness of the presence of love. And so now the authority that plays on that to instill guilt in the child is simply instilling disintegrative energies that are totally and completely against the law. And the child ends up with this whole complex that, when resonated into activity, has many, many, many goals attached to it. Each time the child went back to the adult in enthusiasm and got beat down verbally, emotionally, physically, there was a different goal that the child had. The goal to be approved, the goal to be accepted, the goal to be treated lovingly, the goal to be treated fairly, the goal to be honored. I mean, a thousand goals involved there. And remember that, pardon me, each time that a goal is active in the mind, there is a stress created. And you'll remember the power person workshop or aspect of the codependence work, and that is that when a power person dynamic is instilled in a child's mind, and it's usually between a child and a parent, although not always, but when that's instilled in a mind, and it's instilled when the parent, again, usually a parent, has more power over the child than the child has. The parent is not functioning out of love, is literally not functioning as a human being, and the child perceives it as survival. When that happens, the child's energy field opens wide. And when their field opens wide, they are like a learning sponge. They literally, like, this is survival stuff. The child perceives this. They literally suck up, like a sponge, every energy in the environment. If the parent is in rage, if the parent's in pain, if the parent's in blame, if the parent's in guilt themselves, then the child absorbs those energetic patterns. Once that power person dynamic is instilled in a mind, it doesn't matter how many years later it is. It can be 2, 10, 50, 90 years later. When the stress is up and the chips are down, that person will behave out of that power person dynamic. In fact, their whole lives will be limited to just 3 behaviors. And the 3 behaviors will be based upon interactions with the power person and the level of stress that that individual is under at whatever stage in their lives that behavior is going to come out. The 3 behaviors are related, as I say, to the level of stress. When there's little or no stress, a person will do, their behavior will be whatever they did to get along with their power person. When stress starts to build, that individual will do whatever it is they did to resist and survive with their power person. It becomes a survival issue. And when that individual becomes ultra stressed, they will then reach back into their memory bank and retrieve the behavior that the power person used to win over them, the behavior that they hated the most, and that's what they'll do to others. So all of the goals, recognizing that all of the goals from each time that a thought disorder related to guilt, that's going to end up as this complex of guilt live in a mind and not canceled, stress builds. And that's why people end up doing the exact opposite of what the authority was trying to do with guilt. That's why it backfires. Literally, because of the energetic dynamics involved and all of the energy instilled in the way of guilt, it's like, whoa, bright, attractive energy there around that behavior. And this person moves in doing exactly the opposite of what the authority was hoping they would do. So because the confusion of the goals associated with guilt end up creating so much stress that one ultimately defaults to their most hated person behavior. And so at that moment, then one tends to step into the pseudo solutions of the non-being mind. That's where the non-being, I mean, it's such a, for so many people, it's such a huge complex of energy that it literally takes over the whole perceptual system. And now one starts to think in terms of pseudo solutions. All of the things that their power person tried to do that never worked, but were repeated, and one was lectured and told how this is the solution. wait a minute, why was the power person instilling guilt in the child in the first place? Because the power person was under stress playing out their power person dynamic. And that leads to these pseudo solutions that one gets locked into. And so for most people, there'll be many, many, many worksheets to be done. So our mind shifter for healing guilt. Whenever I find myself thinking negatively about myself, comma, or feeling the effects of guilt or blame. So whenever I find myself thinking negatively about myself or feeling the effects of guilt or blame, comma, I use that as a signal to become conscious of and forgive. So whenever I find myself thinking negatively about myself or feeling the effects of guilt or blame, I use that as a signal, conscious of and forgive even my most subtle self-invalidating thoughts. Now, if you happen to be new to the show and you're not familiar with the mind shifter, the simple use of it, the idea is to use it as a resonating energy to surface things from the unconscious mind to strengthen the energy that of unconscious thoughts until they can pop through to the surface and come to awareness. So each time you write it, if there's a thought disorder related to this mind shifter, and it may be surrounded with all kinds of pain and trauma, and it's something you haven't thought for 50 years, it might be the 10th time you write this mind shifter that literally the resonance, the transfer of energy to that unconscious complex thought starts to move it till it comes to awareness, and all of a sudden, bang, there it is. So what you do is you take a piece of paper and you divide it down the middle and you write the mind shifter on the left-hand side. And then as you write it, pay attention to your breath. Make sure your breath is moving. The way that we keep things unconscious is by holding the breath. An indicator that there's something unconscious going on in someone in response to something happening in the world is they hold their breath. The breath is the way to restrict the flow of awareness and mind energy within the system. So again, I'll run through the mind shifter just one more time to make sure everybody's got it. Whenever I find myself thinking negatively about myself or feeling the effects of guilt or blame. So Linda, you could break that one down to, whenever I find myself thinking negatively about myself, then skip over, and then whenever I find myself feeling the effects of guilt or blame. I use that as a signal to become conscious of and forgive even my most subtle self-invalidating thoughts. So what I'd suggest, if this is a topic that's resonating for you, I'd suggest taking a time period of at least 3 hours. The cell phone is off, the telephone is off the hook or unplugged, the TV is off, you're totally focused in your own space. You've got a sign in the front door that says, "Do not disturb." And you write. And you write the mind shifter, and you write it, and you write it. And every thought that comes up in response to that, you record on the opposite side of the page. Once you complete that, give yourself an intermission from it, go back to it, and start to look at what you've written. If you really allow yourself to go into depth in a mind shifter, quite often when you go back and read what you've written, you won't even remember having read it. You won't even be conscious that it was yours, and it may not even look like you're writing. As Jeannie likes to point out, when she sees that her writing's gone off track, she'll start looking at, when she goes back to review the mind shifter, she'll start looking at, well, when did my writing, gee, I was in grade 3. What was going on in my life in grade 3? And that can cue one into what are the energetic patterns that need to be resolved in that situation. And so you've completed the 3 or 4 hours of writing. You take that writing and you go back and you read each thought that you've written on the right-hand side of the page. And if any more thoughts come, jot them down. The idea is to touch into the subtlest thoughts that most often we're so busy and we're so outer focus that we never let ourselves pay attention to. Here you want to really let yourself pay attention to what's in there. And then whatever you touch into that you realize is part of this complex of guilt or shame or self-blame, then you determine which tool you're going to use to resolve that. Let's, think of an example. So somebody's writing this and they touch into, oh, I had such self-hatred when, my brother left home and never came back. Phew, self-hatred involves blame. So what am I going to do with that? Well, one, I'm going to sit down. Here would be my resolution on that. Here's the work involved in that. I would sit down and write a responsibility communication to my brother that maybe I haven't talked to in 20 years because he left in that situation. I'm going to do some forgiveness on the self-blame aspect of that. I'm going to dig out worksheets and do the forgiveness work there. I'm going to include in my letter to my brother the commitment. As I find myself holding my breath and feeling guilty about what went on with my brother, I'm going to go to the mirror, I'm going to read the commitment to myself and allow myself to become fully conscious of the thoughts of self-blame or self-deprecation that I have. And I'm going to forgive as to those thought disorders. So I'm digging up the, if we go to the opening words in the book of John, in the opening words of John, it does not say in the beginning was the Word and the Word became flesh. What it says is in the beginning was the mind energy and the mind energy became flesh. What you're literally doing is you're learning the skill and the ability of digging into your own carbon-based memory, into literally your own cellular and genetic structure, and bringing forward those energetic patterns that in the cell express as dis-ease energies. You're bringing those forward with the idea of exposing them to love and therefore transmuting the energy, not putting the thought disorder back in the cell, but accessing the energetic pattern and by exposing it to love, freeing yourself of its impact. It's called healing. Healing does not come from taking the pill. Healing does not come from taking in a toxic substance that creates diseases. And you look at just about everything that's called, just every pill, take a look at the insert on the package and look at the diseases it causes. Those things are about treatment. Yes, they can get rid of a set of symptoms and can give you time to do the healing work, but the healing work will always remain your own. And so as I'm continuing to work around that particular situation with my brother and the guilt I had and the fear that I had, I might end up doing worksheets around fear. I may end up doing a codependent worksheet around the fact that while I had all this guilt and self-blame, I was also blaming my brother. So that might be what the end result of doing a mind shifter would look like. So I'd go through literally every thought that I touch into, and when I look at it and I go, is that based in love? Is that supporting love in my cellular structure moving through my cells? If not, then I need to be about forgiving it. I need to be about relieving it, removing it. Remembering that forgiveness isn't about letting somebody off the hook for what's going on inside of me, but it's literally the tool with which I go in and open what's going on inside of me and remove the energetic patterns that never belonged. And anything based in hostility or fear does not belong within the human system. And the reason for that is because when you put hostility or fear in any of its forms into the human cell, it inhibits the flow of love in the cell. It inhibits the flow of life. It's literally what death is made of. When you go back to Yeshua 2,000 years ago, and you notice he didn't say, I come to bring you dogma. Come to bring you religious dogma. How cool is that? I come to bring you a doctrine to live by. You notice he didn't say that. He very, very clearly said why he was here. He said, I come to bring you life, and life more abundantly. In other words, I come to show you how to liberate your cellular structure of anything that inhibits love moving through it, of anything that inhibits your life flow. And remembering that, the word that was used in Aramaic to describe that which inhibits the flow of love in the cell was the word sin. And that sin is an archery term. When you fire at the bullseye and you miss the bullseye, the scorekeeper yells sin, you're off the mark. All the word means, it's an energy that's off the mark. Every energy that's put into a human cellular structure, and oftentimes, sadly, these energies are put into the cellular structures of children by religious figures, by religious leaders, and by parents, who, if you asked either of them, would cherishes that child so much, but is ignorant of the fact that they're passing the sin of their generations, the energies that are off the mark, those energies from previous generations, they're just unconsciously, through the automatic decision system, being driven to pass those on to their children, to their offspring. It's insane, but that's what happens. And the key is this happens when people are under stress, have more goals than they can handle in the moment. That's when they'll default to those generational patterns. So if you recognize that there are energies within you that are off the mark, that inhibit the flow of love through your cellular structure, then turn to the teachings of one who knew exactly what life was about and exactly how to liberate. Stuff isn't about religion. This stuff lives right where you work, right where you have your children, your parents, your lovers, your friends, your spouses. That's where this teaching lives. And yes, you're going to move through the unconscious patterns of the generations, and each thing, this tool we just offered, this mind shifter, will open so much for most people of those generational patterns that need to be forgiven, that need to be removed. And when they're removed, when they're liberated from the cell, more love can flow through the cell. That's life. That's how we get to life more abundantly. This wasn't religious stuff. Just the way it works. So we're here to support it working for you.